When you see a pair of dice, does your mind immediately go to Monopoly, or maybe something a little more ancient, like Farkle? Welcome to Hero Crafted. I'm Justin, and today we're going to be going over the Gambler's Craft. We're going to be carving our own medieval dice from bone, using a little bit of geometry and a whole lot of luck. So, imagine you're in a cramped 14th century tavern. You've bet your last silver penny on a game of dice. You get your cup, you start to roll, and then the city guard kicks in the door. What do? You eat the dice. Or, if you're not that hungry, you throw it in the toilet. And this isn't a joke. Archaeologists digging through cesspits and mud pits have found these tiny medieval dice thrown exactly where people don't want things to be found. Because when the authorities show up, the easiest way to get rid of evidence is to throw it where no one ever wants to go. You see, dice are the oldest gaming implement in history. The Romans used them for everything, and I mean everything. They used it to pass time, settle bets, make extremely questionable decisions on an empty wall. But by the Middle Ages, the six-sided die became an obsession all across Europe. Kings gambled, peasants gambled, soldiers gambled, nuns gambled. In some medieval transcripts, church authorities had complained about dice games, so even holiness has downtime. But making a bone die in the 14th century wasn't as simple as pouring plastic in a mold. It required the right part of an animal, careful filing and cutting, and an understanding of number layout that we assume most medieval people just didn't have. And today we're going to be exploring that dirty, smelling, and surprisingly mathematical part of medieval history. We're going to take a look at the famous Libros de los Juegos, or the Game of Books, published in 1283, get an understanding of why medieval dice look so wonky, and make some of our own. Which means I have to prepare some cow bone in my kitchen, which honestly sounds like a terrible idea, but here we are. Now if you want some bone dice, you're gonna need some bone. See, wood was sometimes used, and ivory and metal was typically only for the wealthy, but bone was medieval's plastic. Bone was everywhere. It was a byproduct of the butcher, and it was relatively cheap, so it was used for a lot of things. Now the best bone for dice is not going to be the big femur that people would think of. What you want is the dense, thick-walled bone of the lower leg, the bovine metatarsal or metacarpal, often called a shin or a cannon bone. And these bones were long and strong because they have to hold up the 1,000-pound animal. This dense outer wall is the cortical bone, and that's the good stuff. But the spongy interior bone is called cancellous bone, and that is absolutely not what you want for these dice. But you can't just go carving these raw bones. You gotta clean and degrease them first. So, the historical word that people typically use is called maceration, which basically means letting the meat break down in water over time. And I don't have the patience, smell tolerance, or the marital agreements to do that. So I'm gonna do a gentle simmer with soap to remove that fat marrow and the meat from the outside of the bone. And this isn't gonna be like a violent boil, it's just gonna be a simmer. And that's because if you cook it too aggressively, the bone could become brittle, no good. So I simmered it for about 2 hours, cleaned off the rest of the tissue, and then I soaked it in hydrogen peroxide for about a day. This whitens it and sterilizes it. Do not use bleach when doing this. Bleach can damage the bone. And anytime you're using any kind of strong hydrogen peroxide, make sure to use eye and hand protection. And this is the glamorous part where we turn trash from the butcher into a gaming object. But this brings us to our first historical hurdle. Who was making these? In medieval cities, you didn't necessarily get something like a dice maker's guild. Instead, dice were typically made by the same people who carved bone, making combs, counters, beads, and other devotional items. And a group who often gets attributed to that is the paternosters. And paternosters made prayer beads, or what we'd attribute to rosaries. And those rosaries were often made of bone. So, in one of the greatest ironies of medieval history, the same people making those little holy items that would save your soul were also making the ones that would damn it. But hey, business is business. And so the first step we typically have is we need a blank. And bones are not squares, they are tubular. So all I'm doing is sawing the straightest, thickest piece I can. And for a usable medieval style die, I'm aiming for like 12 to 15 millimeters. But I'm cutting a little oversized for that since we're gonna have to file down. And let me tell you, bone is hard. And when you saw it, the friction's going to release a certain smell. If you've ever had a cavity drilled or started burning hair, that's gonna be everywhere in your shop. And please make sure to use a respirator while doing this, as bone dust is not nice on the lungs. So while I try to saw a straight line in this bone, let's talk about our primary historical context, the Libros de los Juegos, or the Book of Games. Commissioned by King Alfonso X of Castile, also known as Alfonso the Wise. In 1283, this manuscript is one of the most important pieces of historical documentation on medieval games. It covers chess, dice, and tables, which is related to backgammon. And Alfonso frames these games in a very interesting way. Chess is for intelligence, dice is for luck, and tables is a mix of both, which means that medieval people absolutely knew the difference between luck, skill, and that little gremlin on your shoulder that says, I can win it back in the next roll. And here's the first blank. Is it a square? No. Is it perfect? No. But does it have potential? Theoretically. What we need to do to get this blank down further is to file it, and files were absolutely in the medieval tool chest. And the method is simple, but not so easy. First you need to file one face flat. I did this on the bottom, or the inside of that tube where that cancellous bone is, to get rid of it. And then you flatten the other side, trying to make sure the two sides stay parallel. You do the same thing for the remaining four sides, and all of a sudden you got this square-ish rectangle. From that rectangle, I was able to cut out about 3 cubes, and these cubes are not perfect. And if you look at medieval dice, this is no different. Some look squashed, some are rectangular, and some look like they were filed in an earthquake. And for a long time, you look at these dice and you think, wow, these guys really couldn't get a square, could they? But that's where we get a little sneaky. Some dice were probably off because handwork is handwork, and time is money. They need to get these out, and they did not need to meet casino standards. But some irregular dice have been found to be irregular on purpose. If you shave one axis of a dice, you completely change how it'll land. And these larger faces have a better chance of going up or down. And medieval and early modern authorities were well aware of these loaded dice. People made flats, high men, low men, loaded. Some were subtly shaved, some were weighted, and some were probably so obvious to everybody else except for the poor guy losing. Now for legal, ethical, and I don't want to poison myself reasons, I did not load these or make weighted dice as I don't want mercury poisoning. Today, we're making honest dice, or honest-ish. They're handmade dice. They're not going to be perfect. They definitely have a little bit of that goblin energy going on. So once the dice are filed and mostly square, it's time to lay out the pips. And this is where medieval dice start to look a little different than modern dice. Modern dice just use a simple dot, but medieval dice had a motif called a ring and dot. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a dot with a ring around it, and this required a very special tool called a ring and dot bit. And this tool is basically just a center bit. It has one spike in the middle and 2 spikes on the outside, causing a dot with a ring around it. I made mine from a piece of round bar. I softened the steel, forged it into shape, filed it, hardened it, filed it sharp again, and then I found out it was way too big. It would make 1 dot and circle on each face of the die, and that just wouldn't work. So I just filed it down, made it a spike. It'll just leave 1 dot. It'll be like a modern dice. So if you don't have the patience, you can just use a hand drill and make regular pips. But if you want to stay truly medieval, use the ring and dot bit. But where do we put the dots? On modern die, all opposite sides add to 7. 1 opposite 6, 2 opposite 5, 3 opposite 4. It's called the sevens configuration. But in medieval times, they had something different called the prime configuration. 1 opposite 2, 3 opposite 4, 5 opposite 6. Personally, I just went with the 7 configuration since it's modern. You don't have to do this if you want to stay medieval. Go with the primes. But that being said, the 7s were used in later medieval times, so it's not all that inaccurate. Now you can use dividers to get a perfectly accurate pip location if you want. I didn't feel the need for that. These don't need to be perfect. If you know how many dots are on there, you know how many dots are on there. So I just did it by eye. And then I used my tool, I cut every pip by hand. And remember, bone dust is not nice. It's a respiratory irritant. Wear a respirator, wear eye protection. Do not breathe in the medieval gambling powder. And to fill the pips, I'm gonna use a pretty traditional black pigment. Typically you can use soot, lampblack charcoal, mix it in with a little bit of oil, wax, which will make a dark paste, and you can fill in the dice. Once you do that, you wipe off the excess, and you now have a filled in pip, which stands out against the white back. And for the final polish, I go with some abrasives, some very fine abrasives, 600 sandpaper or so, and then finish it off with some beeswax. The wax helps fill the pores, and it gives it that like ivory gloss on the outside. And then you have these. Are they perfectly precise cubes? No. But do they have personality? Absolutely, and I made them. So you better believe I'm gonna be whipping them out at the next Monopoly game. So how much did this cost? Pretty much nothing. I got these from H-E-B. They're like broth bones or soup bones or something. I add a link in the description. And the rest was kind of spare stuff I had, charcoal, beeswax. Labor-wise, this took a while. It took quite a few hours of sawing, filing, getting them right. But overall, they feel pretty identical to modern dice. They even make the same sound, which I did not expect. I figured they would not sound the same. And I have to give a massive shout out to bone carvers, historical game makers, historical recreators. This is not pleasant. It's slow and smelly and weirdly addictive, which I could probably say about gambling too. But in a world divided by class, wealth, and titles, the game of dice made everyone equal. For a fleeting second, when these bone dice were scrambling across the table, a king and a peasant had the same laws of luck on their side. Unless, of course, one of them brought loaded dice. And if you learned something interesting about the sneaky, smelly, and fascinating world of medieval gambling, consider hitting that subscribe button. It tells YouTube you like hands-on history. Give the video a like. Until next time, I'm Justin. Stay curious, stay making things, and never bet against the guy with the rectangular dice.